Hello and welcome to another episode of The Mark Moss Show, where we talk about, of course, each and every week, the decentralized revolution as we look at the world through the lens of politics, finance, and technology. And of course, that technology is Bitcoin, the decentralized technology that is changing the world. And of course, I try to bring to you some education to change the way you think, the latest breaking news, and some interesting guests. You don't have to listen to me all the time. And so I am joined today by a good friend, Cory Klippsten from Swan Bitcoin. You can find him on Twitter at Cory Klippsten. And also shout out to Swan. Swan Bitcoin is putting together the Pacific Bitcoin Conference coming up here in Los Angeles in a couple of weeks. So you can check it out, pacificbitcoin.com. I'm super excited about it, bringing an event back to my backyard. I'm excited about that. And I'm happy to have you, Cory. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. And obviously, I share your enthusiasm for having a big get-together of Bitcoiners here 2 weeks from today as we record on the 27th. It will be November 10th and 11th at the Barker Hangar in Santa Monica. So, yeah, cannot wait for that.
Yeah, it's about time. You know, I know we talked about this before, but Bitcoin was supposed to be in Southern California, and we kind of lost it, and maybe we can get it back a little bit.
Yeah, we have been talking about that, and I'm not willing to cede the territory, and I never left. You're back. We will do a pincer move from me north of LA and you south of LA, and we're going to take over the whole Metroplex.
Yeah. So, with some of the original cypherpunks, it kind of had this Southern California roots already.
Yeah, this is Hal Finney territory.
Yeah, Hal Finney territory, right? So, we kind of had the Southern California roots. I think if it wasn't for that stupid pandemic, we would have had it here, But anyway, bring it back, and I'm happy for it. So everyone, check that out, pacificbitcoin.com. Check out the tickets. I'm going to be speaking there. Of course, Cory will be there. We got Michael Saylor, the Mega Chad coming, Giga Chad, Alex Epstein, Lynn Alden, Jeff Booth, Robert Breedlove, Preston Pish, Greg Foss. It's going to be awesome. But let's, I know you've been talking about a pretty interesting and super timely and relevant topic. And you're kind of framing it up as the race to avoid war, which, you got to be careful, Cory, because you can get canceled for saying things like that, right? Look what they tried to do with Elon, right? He said that we should have peace. How dare someone recommend peace? I saw today two things. One, Obama now is saying that we should have peace. And two, I saw that they called on the Pope to see if they can get Biden and Putin to sit down together. And I was like, isn't this between Putin and Zelensky? Why the hell does Putin and Biden have to sit down together? Anyway, interesting tidbits. But anyway, you're calling for the race to avoid war. Frame that up for us.
Yeah, this is specifically in the context of Bitcoin, so it's not sort of the kinetic war that we think of. It may turn that way someday. I hope it never does. But basically what it is the only threat to sort of fast, speedy adoption of Bitcoin and bringing forward this future that we all envision with higher productivity, less economic friction, more freedom, more prosperity for 8 billion people on Earth that we think that Bitcoin as global money will bring about. The only entity that can coordinate any sort of major delay to that is the U.S. government, working in consort probably with banks, obviously allies around the world that sort of rely on the Western system that's underpinned by the exorbitant privilege of a treasury and dollar-backed system, and probably a cabal of altcoiners sort of running their grift and attempting regulatory capture and trying to insidiously creep into banks and governments and affect regulations and do things that are contra Bitcoin. So that's kind of the three parties that think today that they might have the most to lose from a Bitcoinized, hyper-Bitcoinization type future. And so
the three were the
government,
the Federal Reserve government, crypto grifters,
and banks. Yeah, so that's sort of the axis of evil in Bitcoin terms.
Yeah.
But they're not evil people. They just don't understand. I actually firmly believe that most of these people just don't understand what they are doing when they delay Bitcoin adoption. So you're not going to be able to stop Bitcoin from winning. It will win. The question is whether it wins handily and early, and we're living in 2035, 13 years from now, with Bitcoin as a widely used store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account, and it's full global money. Or do we have to go dark, and there's wars on Bitcoiners and boots on neck for anybody that has a KYC stack, and all this sort of like hiding around the world, and everybody using NIMs, and we have to like fight it out for a century, and you have to wait until the 2100s or something like that for Bitcoin to dominate. And so I, being of a certain age and wanting to enjoy as much of a Bitcoinized future, like selfishly, I want that. But then also I think there is, as outlined by Andreas Antonopoulos probably 7-8 years ago, like if Bitcoinization can stave off one episode of hyperinflation anywhere in the world, then we all kind of have a moral imperative to try to make it happen as fast as possible. So while I do empathize with people who say, I don't mind it taking a long time, I like cheap sats and I want to build a fatter stack for myself, I personally have made the judgment that I think there's, a moral case for trying to make it happen as fast as possible. And that means winning this race for adoption before the triumvirate can declare war on Bitcoin and Bitcoiners. Because if you get to that point where we have an intransigent minority, in particular in the USA, of call it 10 million Bitcoiners, that's 3 or 4% that's kind of required to on a single issue, that you have people that just won't budge on that issue, that will kind of flip society. That's generally the threshold you need to hit. So if we win that adoption race, then we will never have to fight the war, because it will just look too preposterous to try to wage it.
I remember when you first started Swan, and I remember you saying that was the kind of the goal, the target. So you've been kind of pretty focused on that from the beginning. In regards to that, I would say a couple things. So one, it seems like, with Biden's executive orders that he put through, maybe that already kind of sped up or declared the war, potentially. Let's talk about that first. So, through these Biden executive orders, right, they needed to do all this research into digital assets and central bank digital currencies. Do you think that was an escalation or speed up the timetable to that potential war?
Yeah, so that's something that I would put in the column of this delays Bitcoin adoption and speeds up the potential for some kind of coordinated effort contra Bitcoin. So that's generally how I like, everything's in one category or the other at this point. It's like, if you are Andreessen Horowitz and you start a new fund and you hire some regulators as GPs to get around the lobbying rules so they can just spend all their time trying to wrest regulation over crypto securities from the SEC and basically do regulatory capture of the CFTC by offering them tons of money so they will regulate you in a friendly fashion. That's something that's working contra Bitcoin. If you are, Ripple and Consensus and, Vitalik and Sam Bankman-Fried and all these guys, Brian Armstrong, Fred Arsom, all these guys, pumping out these ESG narratives and trying to pretend that proof of stake is innovative in some way, and, Ripple funding Greenpeace to do anti-Bitcoin proof of work campaigns, like, you're working contra Bitcoin. I'm not going to tell some dude that I'm playing basketball with who happens to be into crypto or blockchain or whatever that he's an enemy of human freedom, because he's not really understanding it the way that we might.
It's probably the number one objection that no coiners would have to Bitcoin. But the government's going to make it illegal, right? And it's that inevitable showdown, which everybody kind of knows that the central bankers, the powers that be, will never want to give up control over the money. And so there was always going to be this like inevitable showdown that's coming, right? Yep. I think that's kind of this war. But back to this war, is it speeding up? So we were talking about before the break this the Biden executive orders where he gave 180 days to do all this research and kind of bring this stuff back, which they've done. And it seems to be picking up the timetables on the CBDCs as well. And, we see, obviously, the rhetoric happening from the ECB and the IMF and all these other regulatory bodies. But then on the other side, so you said if we can get to 10 million users needed, that's kind of like this base number. I thought the numbers were more like there was 25 million Americans that were already
Yeah,
Bitcoiners?
so specifically it's Bitcoiners. And a Bitcoiner, the way I think about it, is someone who has a decent chunk of their net worth in Bitcoin and actually has pretty good understanding of Bitcoin and actually gives a shit, or cares about it, I should say.
Okay.
So that's a much, much smaller number. I'd probably peg that at maybe 100 to 200,000 people in the USA today. And I think that's probably about right in that range. Because you need people that are, going to make life a little bit difficult for a politician that comes out contra Bitcoin, which we saw play out in the primaries in the congressional race out here in SoCal with Brad Sherman, who's kind of the most vociferous anti-Bitcoin guy in Congress the last few years. And a primary challenger came up who was willing to learn about Bitcoin and willing to talk about it and make it an important issue in her campaign. And even though she didn't win, he seems pretty obvious. He hasn't said a peep about Bitcoin in a year. It seems pretty obvious he got the message that a lot of people will come in and make life difficult for him and create challengers for him and fund his opposition if he goes at Bitcoin. So that's the type of thing that you need kind of nationwide at every level, is these 10 million Bitcoiners that are willing to organize around Bitcoin, be pro-Bitcoin, and be, make life difficult for people that are anti-Bitcoin.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and we're definitely getting there. I mean, to your point, the Brad Sherman race was a perfect example of that. I also remember, just recently when they tried to change some of these rules about the protocols and what's a crypto broker, things like that, and they opened up for comments. And then they got so many comments. I saw, Coin Center and so forth put out data that say that they had no idea that they were going to get this type of a response and that they were overwhelmed. Which, whatever, crypto people or whatever, I don't know what the difference of Bitcoin or crypto was, but they're just overwhelmed by the amount of people that came out in support of that. And I think they're taken back by that. And it seems like we're starting to see more and more politicians kind of running on this. I don't know. I haven't figured out how to divide the Bitcoin and crypto, but running on this pro-Bitcoin or pro-crypto, pro-freedom money kind of movement. Yeah. So
I can help you very quickly with that one. I mean, the coordinated response to try to protect the crypto grift machine that is everything in the crypto space that's not Bitcoin was basically because they have a ton of funding from all these crypto VCs that have been, dumping these pump and dumps on retail and clipping the coupon on that, making a lot of money on that. So they have plenty of money to go and try to argue their case, which is why they have, Sam Bankman-Fried has $6 million spent on campaigns in the last cycle. And, these guys are trying to lobby to, again, get the CFTC to regulate crypto instead of the SEC, things like that. So they have plenty of money to argue for crypto. There's very little money to argue for Bitcoin. And I think that was what we learned in 2021 when the infrastructure bill came out and it had some of this stuff in there. And all of the crypto advocates and the blockchain groups and the crypto coin center types were perfectly willing to throw Bitcoin under the bus and say say things like running a Lightning node is the same as being an Ethereum staker and all this sort of false narratives to serve their own ends and keep their grift going as long as possible.
Yeah, and that's a big problem. I mean, we saw, recently, with what SBF, Sam Bankman-Fried, has come out with, basically kind of laying Bitcoin down at the altar, so to speak, right? Like, hey, fine, get rid of the POW, we'll comply with the green climate energy, let us keep this little kind of piece over here as long as we can kind of control it. So we see that, but then also, So there was a big pushback, not just in money spent, but in the amount of people that said that. And then also, it looks like there's maybe at least a dozen, if not maybe a couple of dozen of pretty high-ranking politicians. We saw Patrick McHenry, who was like the head of the Republican head of the Financial and Fiduciary Committee. He specifically said no Bitcoin and it can't be stopped, et cetera. Cynthia Loomis, to name a couple. But
Warren
I know
Davidson. We have there's a handful that actually get Bitcoin and are saying things the right way. There's unfortunately more than half of them are really just trying to get campaign donations from crypto grifters. So they say pro crypto blockchain things and talk about innovation that they don't understand because there isn't any, and they're essentially just trying to get the money to flow into their district or their state or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a big dichotomy there. There's some people that understand that this is freedom money and that this is the best thing for America and for the world is to switch to a Bitcoin standard over time. And then there's a bunch of people that are just looking for the quick buck and, kind of the politics version of a Matt Damon Super Bowl ad for, a scam website.
Yeah. And that's a problem, right? Especially for people that aren't super educated, where they want to be this like single issue voter. And so then you get in a situation like in New York, right, where someone runs on a pro Bitcoin platform and then they want to ban Bitcoin mining. And it's like, wait a minute. Like, and so kind of trying to figure that out. But yeah, it is growing. It sort of seems to me. Well, then what about the banks? So you kind of framed up the war against the banks. That was one of your three factions. But if you look at, a lot of the big financial institutions, Fidelity comes to top of mind, but, even Goldman Sachs, et cetera, a lot of them have spent, I would estimate, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to bring Bitcoin services, right? They want to tap into it greedily, right?
Yep.
And so they want to offer Bitcoin services because there's money to be made there. Do they want to just let the government just take that away from them?
So
would they be fighting for that?
Listen, it's multivariate. There's so many things going on. The banks want to play a role in CBDC stuff. They want to participate alongside Amazon and Google and all the venture firms in squeezing as much profit as they possibly can out of this, crypto scam bubble, crypto blockchain magic, whatever. And at the same time, obviously, there are revenue streams associated with Bitcoin as an asset, and increasingly, especially the back half of this decade, I think, Bitcoin as payment rails. So there's a fight between firms and inside of firms, that Bitcoin versus crypto versus the legacy system continues unabated.
So framing up this war, we talked about the factions. The war is escalating because of what the Biden administration, the executive orders have done, et cetera. We also have the banks and politicians. Some are kind of in it for their own greedy reasons. Some are, kind of there. The one thing that I think we kind of also have going on the pro-Bitcoin side is that, when the Biden administration comes out and starts talking about clamping down on guns, gun sales go through the roof. And it seems like the governments are almost doing Bitcoin marketing in a sense where like you have the trucker protest, right? And like they start seizing people's money and all of a sudden people are like, oh shoot, that money in the bank isn't safe. Maybe I should think about Bitcoin. And so all of a sudden Bitcoin kind of came to the forefront of people's minds. And it seems like, like people would say, well, they'll just make it illegal. And I'm like, well, like the war on drugs, since 1971, since the DEA was formed, drugs have only gotten bigger and bigger. And when the government tells you not to do drugs, it doesn't make me want to do them. But if the government tells me I don't have the right to keep my wealth in a way they can't steal or manipulate from me, it sort of makes me want to do that.
Yeah.
Do you think that maybe the more they try to crack down and shove a CBCD down our throats, maybe that actually highlights and pushes the need for Bitcoin? I mean, I know you believe it pushes the need more.
I think CBDCs, if they roll out in any major economy, will ring the alarm bell. So I think what you'll see is, let's say if CBDC rolls out in central bank digital currency where literally the central bank controls the whole damn thing and there's no banks in between and they can just like put money in your wallet or take it away or create rules like, you can use it on yogurt but not on ice cream, things like that. So if that rolls out in an economy like the UK and Americans are looking across the drink at something like that, I think you would basically see all the conservatives and constitutionalists and libertarians just go absolutely nuts and get orange pilled very, very quickly. Kind of the way all the macro people found Bitcoin in 2020 after the COVID crash. I think that would be that same kind of thing. If you actually started to see a really nasty, CCP style CBDC roll out in a Western nation, especially an economy of some size, I think that would be the wake up call to the sort of freedom-minded organizations and swaths of the political spectrum in the USA.
Yeah. Yeah, and so we're definitely going to see that. I was talking about earlier this article from the IMF. I'm talking about how central bank digital currencies would let governments control what people spend money on, right? That's what they said. And Neil Kasharsky, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, wrote, quote, "I can see how China is for this. I don't see how Americans would want this."
Yeah,
And
we
so,
all went from big Neil Kashkari haters a couple years ago to being big Neil fans a couple months ago when he tweeted that out. Yeah, he's got that right. He nailed it. This is marching into the arms of tyranny and the worst dreams of science fiction writers of the 60s and 70s. If you go this way, this is not the American way.
yeah. It also seems, and so you framed up these different factions, right? So you have the banks, and let's just talk about the banks and the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
I had done a YouTube video a while back, a month or two ago, talking about this kind of from a different angle, which was just like this ultimate war, this ultimate showdown where the central banks don't want to give up control over money, which we'd all agree on. Which central bank wants to give up control of money? So it seems like you have like this Euro Davos ECB group, which kind of the Obama-Biden administration is going along with that, which then they have this whole green transition initiative, which they want to spend $150 trillion over the next 30 years, which would then crush the currencies to print that much more. And then the Fed seems to be fighting back. Like, does the Fed want to give up control over the dollar to the ECB? So you kind of have this infighting, but then at the same time, you have the banks. So in the United States, we still have like the Federal Reserve, and then we have these independent banks, right? And so the banks don't want to give up control over the money either. And so you have like the banks fighting against the Fed fighting against the ECB. Maybe they have enough on their hands to worry about.
Well, I think it's a mistake to say, hey, these are the adversaries. What it really is about is there are people, governments, and companies that do things that help Bitcoin adoption and help us run faster. And there are people, governments, and companies that do things that hurt Bitcoin adoption and make us run slower. And that increases the likelihood that a war on Bitcoin and Bitcoiners takes place. And it basically brings it further forward, that it could happen sooner. So basically makes it harder for us to win this race if the war comes sooner with more force. And so there can be people, governments, and companies that do a bit of both. As you were noting, there are companies and banks that are making it easier to buy Bitcoin while also participating in all this anti-Bitcoin stuff out the other side. Like I've got a bank's venture arm trying to invest in Swan at the same time as their commercial banking division dropped us yesterday morning with no notice, no email, no phone call, no nothing. That thing is like funded to make payroll at the end of the month, and they took our $500,000 that was in that account and just sent it into the ether, and I have to go hunt it down, and they're going to mail a check to my old home address that I haven't lived in 2 years. 15 days from now, and you can't talk to them, you can't get them to wire the money, you can't go pick it up at a branch, you can't get them to send it to the right address. It has to go to the old address, get returned, then they can send it to a new address in a couple of months. And until then, a growing tech company doesn't have their $500,000, and again, we got shut down with zero notice. So I think every time you interact with the banks and you see, they're not aligned. There's people inside this bank that love Bitcoin or they're pushing it hard, but another division is doing stuff like this. So, like I said, I think there are fights within governments, there are fights within banks, and there are fights, on the individual level too, right? There are people that really like Bitcoin that don't quite understand yet what their crypto activities are doing to increase the chance of a war on Bitcoin and decrease, the chance of us not having to fight a war, or our children being able to enjoy a post-Bitcoinized future and the prosperity and freedom that comes with that, or, maybe just don't make the connection that their actions promoting crypto scams is increasing the chance that some country lives through an episode of hyperinflation that wouldn't happen under Bitcoin. So I think it's incumbent upon each of us to come to an understanding like this, however you get to it or however you end up framing it for yourself. But, everything that the privacy and no KYC Bitcoin faction does is making Bitcoin look harder to attack. every time somebody sets up, a mining operation in the hinterlands of some country on the other side of the world, they make Bitcoin harder to attack. Yep. And so you're kind of hitting it from both sides. We're pushing adoption super hard here in the West with Swan, while at the same time very much supporting through, like my venture activities and just kind of promoting on all our media channels whatever we can about people that make Bitcoin look harder to attack. Everyone's working in concert. If you look at, are you doing something that's good for Bitcoin and helping us win the race? Or are you doing something that's, bad for Bitcoin and making it harder to win the race and thus bring about a war on Bitcoin?
But Cory, let's talk about this battle a little bit and maybe some of the things that we can do. Now, I'm hopeful, and maybe I'm just as humans, we have to be aware of our own biases, right? And I'm an optimist, so I have this optimism bias. I know I always have to kind of check that. But like I said earlier, they're almost doing the marketing for us. I see Augustin Carstens from the BIS. He said, quote, he said the central banks will have, quote, absolute control over the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And then we'll also have the technology to enforce it. So absolute control. And so my hope, my optimism bias is that as more people see these things, they're going to wake up and realize how bad this is. But they're on their path, and hopefully maybe there's some infighting that slows them down along the way, and we get a couple congressmen, senators, et cetera, to slow it down. But I know you were kind of focused on getting this 10 million number needed or 25 million number needed. I mean, what does the average person do to really kind of help win this war or the race to the war?
Yeah, so to win this adoption race and thus avoid this war on Bitcoin that, again, I don't think is inevitable. There's an inevitable switch over to Bitcoin. It's just a question of when it actually occurs. And, you wanted to talk about sort of timelines and prognostications. I think it can happen as fast as 2035, and that Bitcoin can be established as, a mature store of value. Market cap will be, probably north of 50 trillion, 100 trillion, something like that. And a widely used medium of exchange. And at minimum, another unit of account, probably global, where you may still have some existing fiat currencies like the dollar. Euro's probably gone, but yen is probably still around, maybe the yuan. And, the price tag would also have Satoshis on it. So that's what I think will happen if we win the adoption
I would say
race.
I would probably I'm going to speed that up a little bit. I think by the end of the decade, I think we get there. And the reason why is, just looking at S-curve, right? So S-curve measures a technology adoption rates, and typically 80% is kind of full adoption, right? So if you look at the telephone, the color TV, the black and white TV, the washer machine, et cetera. So typically the time it takes to go from 0 to 10% is the time it takes to go from 10 to 90. And so we probably hit about 10% adoption by 2019. And so maybe by 2029, 2030, maybe we get to that 80% number.
Yeah. So
we're all looking in a
I've been
crystal ball we
talking
don't
about
have.
this quite a lot this year as well, and in particular because I realized that I didn't think it actually fit technology adoption curves. And there's a book written by Carlotta Perez back in 2002 called Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital. And I took it with me for the summer and reread it over the summer. Hadn't probably read it since 2014. I think I read it for the first time in 2010 or something like that. And I think Bitcoin is one of these things that comes along every 30 to 80 years. So the last one being the start of the information revolution, which she at least marks as the first Intel chip rolling off of a fab in 71. And then before that, the first Model T rolling off. So that was the age of mass production. So whenever 1906 or something like that. And before that, Industrial Revolution, and before that, steam, right? So I think it's
about every 50 years.
Yeah, it could be a lot bigger. Yeah. So in what distinguishes a technological revolution from a single technology that made, social media. Hey, there's an industry vertical that got created, right? And it had a technology adoption curve. A technological revolution has an adoption curve that actually changes all industries. Right. And I can't think of anything that fits that better than changing the money for all industries. And so I think Bitcoin is much, much bigger than iPads or the internet, consumer internet or something like that. I think it's bigger. And I think it's more like on the order of the information revolution or the age of mass production or something like that. So I am kind of thinking that I think 2035 is like aggressive but possible. And it's probably, even without fighting a war, you're probably looking at Bitcoin being everywhere by like 2045, 2050. And it could be delayed significantly by decades, maybe even to the next century, if we let the crypto scammers have their way, if we let the CBDC scammers have their way, if we let the banks do what they've always done and just kind of like ride roughshod over the people. We need to fight for this thing. And you asked, what can any individual person do? Like, educate yourself and find your list of resources to help your friends. I always give away swan.com/free book, which is, in my view, the best book ever written on Bitcoin, Inventing Bitcoin by Jan Pritzker. I think the Bitcoin Canon is an amazing resource. So this is Bitcoiners that have been around for a long time putting together their go-to list of resources on different topics. So it could be like Bitcoin and macro, Bitcoin and energy, Bitcoin 101, Bitcoin and privacy, things like that. So that's at swan.com/canon, CANON. And you can see, what Matt Odell has to say about a topic, or Safety, or Stefan Livera, or Lynn Alden on different topics that they're passionate about. And they've sat down and created a curated list of resources on that topic for you to dive into. And I find that to be one of the best. Those are like the best links that you can send people new to Bitcoin, because they can find somebody that they like and they trust, and then you can send them what that person has to say about what's important in Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's always through education. I constantly just recite the quote from Samuel Adams that said, "It doesn't take a majority to prevail, but rather a small irate minority, keen on setting brush fires in the minds of men." And that brush fire is that educational piece, like waking people up to these things. And I like to tell people too, like, don't just receive this information that you and I are discussing, or I do on my shows, or you do on other shows. Like, don't just receive it, but like, go discuss it with somebody else, right? Yeah. Go share it and just create a discussion about it. Spark that creativity, spark that brush fire, and it just continues to spread and spread and spread.
Yeah, you're so right about finding somebody to discuss it with. And I think it's probably been like a year since I said this URL on air somewhere, and I don't know why I stopped, but like I think Telegram is probably the place where the best Bitcoin discussions happen, other than in public on Twitter. And so if you download Telegram, then in any browser, you can just put t.me/swanbitcoin. And in there are like thousands of people that are just talking about Bitcoin topics and discussing Bitcoin and helping each other learn about Bitcoin and sending tips to each other and new resources and links. And a lot of the top people in Bitcoin that come on our shows, like Mark and Lynn and a lot of these folks will be in there, and you can actually just ask them questions in real time. So yeah, I think conversation is a big part of it. I should mention, by the way, since you mentioned the conference a couple of times, use code SWAN, SWAN, for 20% off of tickets. And if you're down for the VIP experience, there's an amazing VIP party on the evening of the first night. And then there's a beach mansion wrap party on the 12th on Saturday that is also part of the VIP experience. So I think it's a heck of a deal for people that want to kind of upgrade their conference experience, and use code SWAN either way.
Yep, for sure. PacificBitcoin.com. I'm going to be there hanging out. It's probably cold somewhere, wherever you're at in some part of the world. And November is an amazing time to be in Southern California. Some of the best weather of the year. And not the summer, it's the fall. So come to PacificBitcoin.com, check it out. You're listening to The Mark Moss Show, sitting down with Cory Klippsten from Swan Bitcoin. Thanks for listening.